The old man's hand was shaking when he reached into his pocket, not from fear, not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Across the diner, 260 pounds of tattooed fury had just slammed his fist on the counter, hard enough to rattle every coffee cup in the building. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then the old man stood up. All 5 feet 9 inches of him, 82 years old, bad hip, one good eye, and he walked straight toward the monster. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits you right in the chest, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Henry Pendleton had been coming to the Rusty Spur Diner every Tuesday for 11 years. Not because the coffee was exceptional. It wasn't. Marge, the woman who ran the place, had a habit of leaving the pot on the burner 20 minutes too long. So by the time Henry arrived at his usual hour, 9:30 in the morning, what came out of that carafe was closer to motor oil than anything a reasonable person might call a beverage. Henry drank it anyway, always had, always would. And it wasn't because the cherry pie was worth the 40-minute drive from his property out on the edge of the Shoshone Flats. Though he'd never admit that to Marge, who baked it herself every Monday night and set it out Tuesday morning like she was presenting something sacred. Henry came every Tuesday because Tuesday was the day his wife Linda used to come with him. She'd been gone 6 years now, and he still sat on her side of the booth. He told himself it was because the window seat gave better light. He told himself that every single week, when he slid into that cracked vinyl cushion and looked out at the empty stretch of Highway 50, cutting across the Nevada desert like a scar that never healed, he knew he was lying to himself. He sat there because she used to sit there. Because if he closed his eyes and held his coffee cup just right, he could almost feel her hand reaching across the table to tap his knuckles, the way she always did when she thought he was brooding too much. Henry Pendleton. She used to say, "You are not allowed to be gloomy before 10 o'clock in the morning. That is a rule I made, and it is non-negotiable." He'd give anything to hear her say that one more time. The Rusty Spur wasn't much to look at. It sat at a junction point between nowhere and nothing, flanked on one side by a gas station that hadn't changed its price sign since the Clinton administration, and on the other by a vacant lot where someone had once tried to open a laundromat and given up halfway through the foundation. The diner itself had maybe 12 tables a counter, with 8 stools, a jukebox in the corner that still worked if you kicked it on the lower left side, and walls covered in old license plates, mounted bass, and a framed photograph of the Nevada highway system that someone had hung there in 1987 and never thought to take down. It was the kind of place that time had agreed to leave alone. Henry liked that about it. He was working on his second cup motor oil vintage, aged to perfection, when Bobby Hatch came in through the front door at a pace that was several degrees faster than his usual shuffle. Bobby ran the gas station next door. He was 53 years old, built like someone had assembled him from leftover parts, and he had a laugh that could be heard clearly from the other side of the highway. Henry liked Bobby. Bobby asked him about his tomatoes and never once tried to talk about the war. But Bobby wasn't laughing right now. Bobby walked straight up to the counter where Marge was restocking the sugar dispensers, leaned in close, and said something Henry couldn't hear. What he could see clear as day was the color drain out of Marge's face. Henry set down his cup. "Bobby, pun," he called across the diner. Bobby turned. His eyes did something complicated. "Morning, Henry. What's happening?" It wasn't really a question. Henry had spent enough years asking questions in situations where questions were dangerous to know when a statement worked better. You said it flat. You waited. People filled in the silence themselves. Bobby looked at Marge. Marge looked at Bobby. Bobby looked back at Henry. "Pack of bikes coming down the 50, Bobby said. "Maybe 12, 15 of them. Saw them pass the junction 20 minutes ago. Pulled off at nothing, turned back around. They're headed this way. Lots of people ride motorcycles, Bobby. Not like these people." Bobby lowered his voice, which for Bobby was still louder than most people's normal speaking volume. "Hell's Angels patch. Full colors. The big one in front, I've seen his picture. That's Thomas Cole. They call him Grizzly." The name didn't mean anything to Henry right away, but then something shifted in the back of his memory, something old and buried, and the name caught on something like a fishhook on a snag. Thomas Cole. He turned the name over in his mind the way you'd turn over a rock to see what lived underneath. "Henry," Marge had come around the counter. She was a sturdy woman, the kind who had built her life out of hard work and common sense. And it took something significant to put that particular look on her face. Maybe you should... I'm fine right here, Marge. I just thought, I'm fine. She knew better than to argue. She'd known Henry long enough to understand that when he said something in that particular tone, quiet even with the bottom dropped out of it, it was the last word on the subject. He heard them before he saw them. The sound built from the highway like distant thunder that had made up its mind, not the rolling, uncertain kind that might pass you by, but the kind that was coming directly for you and had been planning it for some time. It moved through the walls of the Rusty Spur and into Henry's sternum, and he felt his jaw tighten the way it used to before a patrol. He told himself that was just reflex. Old muscle memory, nothing more. The door swung open. The first man through was not the largest one, but he moved like he owned the concept of space itself. He had the kind of presence that arrived before he did a shift in air pressure, a change in atmospheric temperature, something animal and ancient that human beings recognized in the deep down part of their brain before the thinking part caught up. He was maybe 45, broad across the shoulders, with a beard that had gone mostly gray and hands that looked like they'd been designed for an entirely different, more violent purpose than anything most people used hands for. The patch on his vest read, Grizzly. The men who followed him fanned out through the diner with the practiced ease of people who had done exactly this sort of thing many times before, moving to cover the angles, claiming the room without saying a single word about it. Henry counted 9 of them, though he suspected there were more outside. He watched the way they moved. He watched the way Grizzly moved. And in the back of his mind, that fishhook in his memory pulled a little tighter. Marge had frozen behind the counter holding a coffee pot like she'd forgotten what it was for. Bobby was still near the door, weighing the social calculus of whether leaving would be obvious. The young couple in the corner booth, newlyweds, Henry guessed passing through on their way somewhere that wasn't here, had gone very still in the way that prey animals go still. The trucker named Dale, who ate at the Rusty Spur every Tuesday, same as Henry, and had never once said more than 12 words to him, was suddenly very focused on his eggs. Grizzly settled onto a stool at the counter. He didn't slam anything, didn't bark at anyone, didn't perform any of the theater that Henry might have expected. He just sat down, set his hands flat on the counter, and said in a voice that was surprisingly moderate in volume, coffee. One of his men, younger, late 20s, with a look about him that reminded Henry of dogs who'd been hit once too often and now bit everything, dropped into a booth and immediately swung his boots up onto the table. He caught Marge looking at him and smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. "What?" the young one said. "You got a problem?" Marge said nothing. "Marge," Henry said. She looked at him. Pour the man his coffee. Something about his voice, steady, unhurried, carrying in it the weight of 1,000 situations where panic had been the wrong choice, cut through the room. Marge poured the coffee. Her hand was shaking, but she poured it. Henry turned back to his window. The name Thomas Cole was still moving around in his mind, coming at it from different angles. Looking for the door he knew was in there somewhere. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers found what they always found there. The small, cool weight of a metal chain, the 2 rectangles of stamped aluminum that hung from it. He didn't take them out. He just held them through the fabric of the pocket, the way he always did when he needed to think clearly. Across the diner, the young one with the boots on the table had apparently decided that the silence was insufficient entertainment. He looked over at the newlywed couple in the corner. "You two honeymooning," he said. "Cute. Where you headed?" The young husband, he couldn't have been more than 24, said carefully, "Just passing through." "Yeah, from where?" "Idaho." "Idaho." The young one repeated the word like he was tasting it and finding it disappointing. "Long drive. You must be tired." He paused. "Your wife looks tired." The husband's jaw tightened. His wife put her hand on his arm. "Viper." Grizzly's voice came from the counter without him turning around. Just the one word. The name. Nothing else. The young one, Viper, rolled his eyes but took his boots off the table. Henry noted that, the chain of command, the single word doing the work of a paragraph. He noted other things too. The way Grizzly held his coffee cup not wrapped around it, the way most people did, but with his fingers through the handle, his other hand flat on the counter. The way his right shoulder sat slightly higher than his left, the permanent architecture of an old wound. The way his eyes, when he thought no one was watching, drifted to the middle distance and went somewhere that had nothing to do with the inside of this diner. Henry had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the mirror for about 40 years. And then Grizzly shifted on his stool and the sleeve of his shirt rode up and Henry saw it. Just a fragment. Just 2 inches of faded green ink on the inside of his left forearm, half hidden by the cuff. But it was enough. Henry's heart did something it hadn't done in a very long time. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition. He sat with it for a moment. He turned it over. He thought about Linda, who used to tap his knuckles and tell him he wasn't allowed to be gloomy before 10 o'clock in the morning. He thought about James. He thought about what James would want. He reached into his inside pocket again. This time he took out what was in there. He looked at the 2 small rectangles of stamped aluminum for a moment. Then he put them in the breast pocket of his shirt close to his chest where he could feel them. He stood up. Bobby, who had been watching him with the expression of a man witnessing something unfold in slow motion and powerless to stop it, made a small movement toward him. Henry. Sit down, Bobby. Henry, you should not. Robert Allen Hatch. Henry straightened his jacket. Sit down. Bobby sat down. Henry began the slow cross of the diner. His hip was bad. Had it been bad for 8 years since the surgery that had gone fine, the physical therapy that had gone mostly fine, and the subsequent 8 years that had gone the way most things went when you were 82, which was to say, not as well as you hoped and better than you feared. He walked with a particular economy of motion that wasn't quite a limp, but acknowledged the hip's feelings on the matter without entirely capitulating to them. He was aware of every eye in the room tracking him. He was aware of the specific quality of silence that had descended, not the absence of sound, but the presence of held breath, which was an entirely different thing. He was perhaps 12 feet from the counter when Viper spotted him. The young man was out of his booth before Henry had taken 3 more steps, moving to intercept with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who had blocked people's paths before and found it generally worked out in his favor. Hey, old man. Viper positioned himself in the aisle, not touching Henry, just occupying space. Where do you think you're going? Henry looked at him. He didn't stop walking. Viper took a half step back without entirely meaning to. Something in the old man's eyes, rearranging his calculations, then caught himself and firmed up. I'm talking to you. Where do you, son? Henry said not unkindly. I have walked through things that would rearrange everything you think you know about yourself. I am going to ask you one time to step aside. The diner was so quiet that the hum of the refrigeration unit behind the counter was suddenly very loud. Viper looked over at Grizzly. Grizzly had turned on his stool. He was watching Henry approach with an expression that was impossible to read, not hostile, not welcoming, something more careful than either. His eyes had gone very focused. He made a small gesture with 2 fingers. Viper stepped aside. Henry walked the last 6 feet to the counter. He settled onto the stool next to Grizzly, the one stool between the man and the wall, and he folded his hands on the counter and he looked straight ahead at the pie case for a moment. Then he said quietly enough that only Grizzly could hear, 1st Battalion 8th Marines Fallujah, November 2004. The temperature in Thomas Cole's body dropped about 10 degrees. He could feel it, a physical thing, and a coldness that started somewhere in the center of his chest and radiated outward to his fingertips. He kept his face still. He had spent 20 years perfecting the art of keeping his face still. What did you say? His voice was very careful. Henry reached into his breast pocket. He set the dog tags on the counter between them with a sound that was barely a sound at all, a small metallic whisper against the formica. My name is Henry Pendleton, the old man said. James Pendleton was my grandson. And Thomas Cole, who had not cried in front of another human being since he was 7 years old, felt something in his face that he had no control over. He looked down at the dog tags. He recognized them. Of course he recognized them. He had stared at a set just like them on a young man's chest for 14 months. He had held an identical pair. His own pair. His memory supplied his own personal inventory of that day in his hands in a truck outside Fallujah, while the world came apart around him, and Corporal James Pendleton stopped moving, and Thomas Cole couldn't figure out why he himself was still alive. He'd been trying to figure that out for 20 years. He talked about you, Grizzly said. His voice had dropped into a register he hadn't used in a long time. He used to talk about his grandfather. Said you, he stopped, started again. Said you were in Korea. Said you told him that fear was just respect for danger and that respect was different from surrender. Henry was very quiet for a moment. That sounds like something I might have said, he admitted. He had a picture, kept it in his left breast pocket. Grizzly had to stop again. The muscles in his jaw were getting complex and involuntary things. Said it was his lucky piece. You and his grandmother on your wedding day. From 3 stools down, Viper had gone completely motionless. He had known Thomas Cole for 9 years. He had never not once seen his face do what it was doing right now. How did you find me? Grizzly asked. Not aggressive, honestly asking. I wasn't looking for you, Henry said simply. I come here every Tuesday, have for 11 years. You pulled off Highway 50, turned around, and came back. That was your choice. He paused. Maybe it was his choice. I've stopped thinking I understand everything that happens. Grizzly picked up the dog tags. He held them in his closed fist for a moment, and his eyes went somewhere far away and 20 years back. I couldn't keep him safe, he said. The words came out flat and factual like a verdict being read. I was his squad leader. It was my job. I couldn't. His fist tightened around the tags. We were clearing a building, east side of the city. He went left, I went right. It was supposed to be clear. It was supposed to be. He stopped. His chest expanded and contracted with the effort of keeping something very large, very controlled. 15 seconds. That's all it was. 15 seconds and he was Thomas. The name stopped him cold. Not the name anyone called him. Not anymore. No one had called him Thomas in 20 years. Thomas, Henry said again in the same voice. Look at me, Yeaton. Grizzly looked at him, and Henry Pendleton, 82 years old Korea veteran, 11 years of Tuesday mornings, alone in a booth that used to seat 2, looked back at him with eyes that held neither pity nor judgment, nor the particular refined cruelty of sympathy offered at the wrong moment. What they held was simpler and harder than any of those things. Understanding, the kind that only comes from having carried your own impossible weight long enough to recognize it on someone else's back. You've been dying for him, Henry said. Every single day for 20 years you have been choosing to die for him in pieces a little at a time. His voice didn't waver. I am asking you to stop. You don't know what I know exactly what you've done. Henry's voice came down on the word like a hand on a table. I've read everything there is to read about Thomas Cole, about Grizzly, about what happened to the man who came home from Fallujah. He paused, letting that settle. You know what James would think of what you've built out of his memory. The muscles in Grizzly's face went tight and hard. He would be furious, Henry said quietly. That boy did not have a single cowardly atom in his entire body. He would be furious to know you'd spent 20 years turning his death into a reason to waste your life. The silence stretched. At the far end of this counter, Marge had set down the coffee pot without realizing she'd done it. Bobby Hatch had forgotten entirely that he'd been planning to leave. Viper was sitting completely still, his eyes on Thomas Cole's face with an expression that nobody in his vicinity had ever seen on him before, something young and confused and almost frightened. You don't get to tell me what he would... He was my grandson, Henry said, level, immovable as bedrock. I changed his diapers. I taught him to drive. I stood in the front row when he graduated from boot camp, and I watched him walk across that field, and I thought, God help me. I thought... Henry's voice shifted just slightly, and for one moment the bedrock showed a crack. I thought that boy is so much braver than I was. The crack sealed itself. He wrote me letters, Henry continued. 1 a month, every month he was deployed. 14 months, 14 letters. You know what he wrote about? Grizzly was looking at him with an expression that had given up pretending to be anything other than what it was. He wrote about you, Henry said, his squad leader. How you always knew when someone was running close to the edge. How you checked on people without making them feel checked on. How you made the scared ones feel less scared without pretending there was nothing to be scared of. Henry's eyes stayed level. He trusted you with his life, and I am telling you right now, you are the only person in this room who thinks you failed him. The sound Thomas Cole made was not loud. It was the sound of something that had been under tremendous pressure for a very long time, suddenly finding a hairline fracture. From down the counter, Viper stood up, not with any of his usual performance, but just stood quietly like a man who doesn't know what to do with his hands. Grizzly put the dog tags back on the counter. He looked at them for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had shed some outer layer that he'd been wearing so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't skin. I dream about him, he said. Almost every night. Same dream. I go right instead of left. I see what's in there first. I pull him back out. He exhaled. And then I wake up. Yes, Henry said. 20 years. Yes. And it doesn't... He stopped. Does it stop? Henry was quiet for a moment, honest quiet, not the kind that's gathering words, but the kind that's respecting a question enough to sit with it first. No, he said, it doesn't stop. But it changes. The dream stays the same, but you stop building your whole life around the moment you wake up from it. He picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, set it back down. You start building it around what you do after. The jukebox in the corner clicked and whirred, and with the total indifference of machinery to human emotion began to play Merle Haggard. Henry almost smiled. Linda would have said that was a sign, he said almost to himself. Who's Linda? My wife. She passed 6 years ago. Henry looked at the dog tags on the counter between them. She used to say signs were everywhere if you were paying attention. I spent 50 years telling her that was sentimental nonsense. Were you right? Henry considered this. I was accurate, he said finally. That's not always the same thing as being right. Grizzly looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that nobody in the Rusty Spur Diner that morning, not Marge, not Bobby, not Viper, not the young couple frozen in their corner booth, had seen him do or would have predicted he was capable of doing. He laughed, not a performance laugh, not the kind deployed for effect or intimidation. A real one, short, unexpected, almost involuntary. The kind that gets out before you can stop it. You are not what I expected, he said. No, Henry agreed. I don't suppose I am. He reached over and picked up the dog tags. He held them out to Grizzly. The big man looked at them in Henry's open palm for a long moment, long enough that several people in the diner held their breath again for entirely different reasons than the first time. Then Thomas Cole reached out and took them. His hand was not entirely steady. Those belong to you, Henry said. Not because you earned them, because James would want you to have them. Because he knew even then, even at 22 years old, halfway around the world, in the worst place either of you had ever been, he knew you were worth saving. From somewhere outside, the sound of motorcycles ticked and cooled in the morning heat. Inside the Rusty Spur Diner, on the loneliest road in America, an 82-year-old man and a 45-year-old soldier who had stopped being a soldier 20 years ago sat side by side at a counter and said nothing for a while. Sometimes that's the most important conversation. The dog tags were warm in Thomas Cole's hand. That surprised him somehow. He'd expected them to feel cold metal always ran cold, but they'd been sitting against Henry Pendleton's chest for however long the old man had been carrying them, and they held that warmth the way held things did, the way something that had been close to a living body for a long time takes on a quality that is almost but not quite alive itself. He closed his fingers around them. He didn't look up for a long moment. When he did, it was because Viper was standing at his shoulder. Boss? The younger man's voice had dropped all its usual performance. Just a word, just checking. You good? Grizzly looked at him. Sit down, Viper. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Sit down. Viper looked at Henry. The look wasn't hostile exactly, but it was the look of a man trying to calculate something he didn't have all the variables for. He stepped back to his booth. He sat. But he didn't take his eyes off the old man at the counter. Henry noticed. He noticed most things. Your boy's loyal, he said. He's protective, Grizzly said. There's a difference. Is there? Grizzly set the dog tags on the counter in front of him, arranged them with one finger so they lay flat. He stared at them the way a man stares at something he isn't sure is real. How long have you been carrying those? Since the notification, Henry said. They mailed me James's effects. These were in the box. He paused. I kept them because I thought someday I'd know what to do with them. And now you do. Now I do. Marge appeared at the end of the counter with the coffee pot moving on autopilot the way people do when they need to do something with their hands. She refilled Henry's cup without being asked. She looked at Grizzly's cup, then at Grizzly, and then she poured for him too. Her hand was steadier than it had been 20 minutes ago. Some situations, once they've defined themselves, are easier to be in than the not knowing. Thank you, ma'am, Grizzly said. Marge blinked. You're welcome, she said, and it came out sounding slightly like a question. She retreated. From outside came the sound of a car slowing on the highway, the crunch of gravel in the parking lot. Henry tracked it without turning his head, old habit, old training. The car didn't stop, passed on through. He released a breath he hadn't consciously been holding. You drove out here by yourself? Grizzly asked. I drive everywhere by myself. My daughter thinks I shouldn't. My doctor thinks I shouldn't. I do it anyway. How far? 40 minutes. Every Tuesday. Every Tuesday? 11 years. Grizzly absorbed that. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You got other family. Besides, he stopped short of saying James's name. He hadn't said it yet. He'd been orbiting it. A daughter, Carol. She lives in Reno. She calls me every Sunday and worries about me every other day of the week. She was James's mother's older sister. Henry took a slow sip. She cried for 2 years after James died. I don't mean that poetically. I mean she cried properly at least once a day for 2 years. She thought she was done, and then she'd find something, one of his baseball cards, a note he'd written on a grocery receipt as a joke, and she'd start again. Did it stop? Eventually. She still has days. Henry set his cup down. She doesn't know I'm here today. She'd be upset if she knew. Why'd you come? Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I'm 82 years old, Thomas, and I have buried everyone I love except Carol, and I have learned that the things you put off doing for the right moment have a way of never getting done. He looked at the dog tags on the counter. I've been carrying those for 20 years. 20 years is long enough. Something moved through Grizzly's face, a recognition, a recalculation. You know who I was, he said, not a question. I know who you are. That's not what I asked. His voice had gone careful again, not cold, but precise. You knew before today. You knew my name. You knew my history. You didn't just, he stopped. His jaw worked. You didn't just happen to find me here. Henry met his eyes steadily. No, I didn't. The word landed in the middle of the counter between them, and neither man moved. 3 stools down, Viper went very still. You've been looking for me, Grizzly said. I've been aware of you, Henry said, for about 3 years. Someone sent me an article, a newspaper piece about a Hells Angels enforcer in Nevada who'd been in Fallujah in 2004. The name Thomas Cole didn't ring any bells at first. He paused. Then I found James's letters, the ones he sent home. I'd read them 100 times, but I read them again. He mentioned you in almost every one. Never your full name. Just Tom. My squad leader, Tom. Tom says this. Tom thinks that Tom showed us how to. His voice caught just barely, just for a second. I put it together slowly. It took me about 6 months to be sure. Grizzly had gone very still. And then what, he said. And then I didn't know what to do about it. So I did nothing for 2 more years. And I thought about Linda, who always said that doing nothing was also a choice, and I should at least be honest with myself that I was making one. Henry's mouth curved not quite a smile. She was usually right. So you decided to find me. I decided to stop not finding you. Henry reached for his coffee. There's a difference. It was a quiet moment, but it hit Thomas Cole somewhere structural, somewhere foundational, because the man sitting next to him had just without fanfare or melodrama dismantled the story Thomas had been telling himself for 20 years. The story that went, nobody is looking for me, nobody knows what I carry, I am unreachable and unaccountable, and that is fine because that is safer for everyone. Henry Pendleton had known where he was for 3 years. Henry Pendleton had carried his grandson's dog tags for 20, and instead of hatred or accusation or the carefully organized grief that had a target on it, the old man had simply sat down next to him and talked. You're not angry, Grizzly said. It came out sounding strange, not quite accusation, not quite disbelief. Oh, I was angry, Henry said simply. For years I was very angry. I was angry at the Marine Corps, and at the government, and at the city of Fallujah, and at God, who I mostly stopped talking to for about 4 years. He set down his cup. I was angry at you for a while, not specifically, just at whoever was with him, at whoever came home when he didn't. Grizzly didn't look away. He took that hit square the way a man does when he's decided he's owed it. What changed, he asked. I read James's letters again. Henry's voice was steady. The ones about Tom, about his squad leader. And I realized he stopped. Something private moved through his face. I realized that the man my grandson wrote home about wasn't someone who deserved 20 years of a stranger's anger. He was someone James trusted enough to follow into a burning building. He looked at Grizzly. That's not nothing, Thomas. That's about everything. At the end of the counter, Marge was crying. She wasn't making a sound. She had her back to the room, pretending to reorganize coffee mugs, and her shoulders were doing the work of keeping it quiet. But Bobby Hatch, who had moved to a stool nearby with all the casual pretense of a man doing nothing in particular, could see her face, and he looked away with the careful discretion of a man who understood some moments were private even when they happened in public. Viper was watching Grizzly with an expression that kept shifting confusion, giving way to something more like bewilderment. Bewilderment edging towards something that might in another man at another time be called awe. He'd ridden with Thomas Cole for 9 years. He'd seen him face down armed men without blinking. He'd seen him walk through situations that made hardened people fold. He'd seen him be, without apparent effort, the most frightening individual in any room he entered. He had never seen him look like this, like a man who had just been given back something he hadn't known he'd lost. A buzzing on the counter, Grizzly's phone face down on the Formica. He glanced at it. His expression shifted. "You need to take that," Henry asked. "No," but Grizzly's jaw had tightened. "It's nothing. Nothing doesn't make a man look like that." The phone buzzed again, then again. 3 rapid succession, the kind of pattern that meant someone on the other end had a particular relationship to patience. Grizzly picked it up, looked at the screen, set it back down face down. "Old business," he said, and the 2 words landed differently than anything he'd said in the last half hour, harder, more guarded, carrying the texture of a door being pulled shut. Henry looked at him for a moment. "Is it dangerous?" "Most business is." "That's not an answer." Grizzly turned to look at the old man. He studied him, really studied him, the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out what they can handle. Henry Pendleton looked back at him with complete equanimity, and Thomas Cole found himself, not for the first time in the last 40 minutes, recalibrating. "There's a man," Grizzly said finally. "A man I used to know. He has a problem that's become my problem, which is a situation I've been trying to not be in for several years." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves people I'd rather not be involved with anymore." He stopped. "The kind that ends badly." Henry nodded slowly. "Are you afraid of it?" Grizzly gave him a look. "That's not..." He stopped, started again. "Fear isn't really the... Are you afraid of it?" A pause, long enough to answer the question itself. "Yes," Grizzly said, "not of the situation." Both of them understood that, not of the danger. Afraid of going back, afraid of who he became when the old machinery engaged. Henry nodded as if Grizzly had said all of that out loud. Maybe he had. "Then you already know what you're going to do." Before Grizzly could answer, the front door opened. The man who walked in was maybe 35 average, build, wearing a trucker hat and a canvas jacket that had the sleeves pushed up despite the heat. He held himself with the careful neutrality of someone who was working very hard at appearing to belong somewhere he didn't belong. His eyes moved around the room in a pattern, quick, systematic, professional, in a way that had nothing to do with any legitimate profession. He spotted Grizzly. He walked over. Viper was off his stool before the man had taken 3 steps, and 2 other members materialized from the booths they'd been sitting in with the practiced speed of people for whom this kind of movement was entirely routine. The man stopped walking. He raised his hands slightly, palms out, conciliatory. "Easy, easy, I'm not carrying." He looked past Viper to Grizzly. "Thomas, I need 5 minutes." Grizzly looked at him with zero expression. Henry stayed exactly where he was on his stool. He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. "5 minutes for what, Reno?" Grizzly said. "Not here. I'm in the middle of something." The man called Reno glanced at Henry, trying to read the situation, not managing it. "This can't wait, Thomas. Salazar's people are..." I said, "I'm in the middle of something." Grizzly's voice had changed register, not louder but lower, with a weight in it that was very different from how he'd been talking the last half hour. "You're going to sit down at that table over there. You're going to order something. And in 10 minutes, you and I are going to talk outside." Reno looked at him, looked at Viper, looked at the two others. Okay, he said carefully. He sat down at a table. Marge, who had pulled herself together with impressive efficiency, appeared and took his order without looking at him directly. The diner recalibrated. Henry set down his cup. Salazar, he said, not as a question. Grizzly looked at him sharply. You know that name? I read about you for 3 years, Thomas. Salazar runs distribution across the high desert. He's been in federal crosshairs twice and walked both times. Henry's voice was entirely conversational. Rumor in certain circles was that he had a former Marine on retainer who handled situations that needed a particular skill set. The silence this produced had weight to it. You did your homework, Grizzly said. I'm old, not uninformed. What else do you know? I know you've been trying to cut loose from that arrangement for 2 years. I know Salazar doesn't let go of useful things easily. Henry turned to look at him directly. I know that whatever that young man was sent here to tell you, it's the thing your phone has been buzzing about for the last 15 minutes, and it's the thing that put that particular look on your face. Grizzly stared at him. For a moment, just a moment, something almost like a smile moved through his expression. Hard and not entirely comfortable, but real. James said you were sharp, he said. James was kind. James was accurate. Grizzly picked up the dog tags from the counter. He held them in his fist for a moment, then with a deliberateness that was unmistakable, he fastened the chain around his neck. He settled it against his chest under his shirt. At the far table, Reno watched this and went very quiet. Viper watched it and swallowed something that wasn't quite visible. What are you going to do? Henry asked. I'm going to go outside and talk to Reno, find out exactly how deep this goes. Grizzly stood. He was very tall when he stood. The full reality of him, the physical fact of the man, reasserted itself in the room. And then I'm going to decide. Decide what? He looked down at Henry. Whether I'm the man I've been or the man you just told me James thought I was. Henry held his gaze. That's not a decision you make once, Thomas. That's one you make every time. Grizzly held his gaze for a beat. Then he moved toward the door, and Reno scrambled up from his table to follow, and Viper moved to the door to hold it without being asked. Henry sat at the counter. He did not look at the door. Bobby Hatch materialized on the stool next to him. Henry, he said quietly, what in the hell is happening? I'm not entirely sure, Henry said honestly. Who is that man? He's someone who's been carrying something too heavy for too long. Henry looked down at his coffee. Same as most people, just a different kind of weight. Bobby processed this. And the guy who just went outside with him. That I don't know yet. Should we be? Bobby lowered his voice. Should we be worried? Henry thought about that. Thought about the tags against Thomas Cole's chest. Thought about the look on the man's face when he'd fastened that chain. No, he said. I don't think so. Outside, muffled by the walls of the diner, a voice rose Reno's and then cut off sharply. Then silence. Every head in the Rusty Spur tilted slightly in the direction of the door, without anyone meaning to. Henry kept his eyes on his coffee cup. 2 minutes passed. 5. Viper, stationed near the door, was the only person in the diner who wasn't visibly recalculating. He just waited, which was its own kind of answer, about the kind of man Thomas Cole was, that his people trusted his silences that completely. The door opened. Grizzly came back in alone. He walked to the counter. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and looked at Henry with an expression that had been simplified somehow, like a sentence that had been revised down to its essential words. Billy Orr, he said. Former Marine Fallujah 2004. He was in my unit. Henry looked up at him. Was he a friend? He was a brother. The word came out unembellished, carrying its own weight. He got out, got into trouble, got out of the trouble, got into different trouble. Salazar's people have him. A debt situation. The kind of debt that gets called in with interest. He paused. They sent Reno to tell me that if I want Billy to walk away from this, I'm going to need to do one more job. One more. And then one more after that, Henry said quietly. Yes. That's how that works. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Henry turned his coffee cup in his hands. How bad is Billy's situation? Bad enough that Reno drove 4 hours to find me personally instead of calling. How much time do you have? Grizzly looked at him. Something shifted in his face, not quite confusion, but recalibration. Why, Wayo? Because I'm asking how much time you have, Henry said patiently. I'm 82, Thomas. I don't ask questions I don't mean. Grizzly was quiet for a beat. 24 hours, maybe less. Henry nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he was clearly thinking, not the anxious, scattered thinking of someone confronted with a problem too large, but the focused, deliberate thinking of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions under pressure and had learned the difference between urgency and panic. Sit down, he said. Grizzly sat. Tell me about Billy. And Thomas Cole, who had not talked about Fallujah to anyone who wasn't there, who had not said James Pendleton's name out loud in 20 years, who had built his entire existence around the principle of not telling anyone anything real, opened his mouth and started to talk. It came out in pieces at first, fragmented, cautious, the way you test a frozen lake before you trust your weight to it. Billy Orr, who was from Youngstown, Ohio, and had a mother who sent him packages of beef jerky and crossword puzzle books. Billy, who was louder than everyone else in the unit combined, and somehow the least frightening person in any given foxhole, because his fundamental decency was impervious to circumstance. Billy, who had held James Pendleton's hand in the truck after, and who had looked at Thomas Cole across that space with an expression that said, without words, without any way to make it better, I know. I was there too. I know. He saved me, Grizzly said. Not that day, but after. When we got home, I was coming apart and Billy he didn't fix anything. He didn't say the right things. He just didn't let me disappear. He stopped. He called me every week for 2 years, just to check. He'd call, I'd pick up. He'd say, you still there? I'd say, yeah. He'd say, good, and hang up. Every week, Henry said, every week, for 2 years. Henry was very still. And then one week I didn't pick up, Grizzly said, and he didn't call again. A pause. I didn't pick up because I was in the middle of something I shouldn't have been in the middle of. And by the time I got clear and tried to call back, it had been 3 months, and he stopped. You lose time in that life. You look up and months have gone by. And Billy had gotten into his own trouble by then. Different trouble, his own version. Grizzly's hands were flat on the counter. I tried to find him 3 years ago. He'd moved no forwarding. I thought maybe he'd cleaned himself up, moved on. He looked down at his hands. Apparently not. Henry looked at the dog tags against Grizzly's chest, invisible under his shirt now, but present in both their awareness. Billy Orr was with you when James died, Henry said. It was not a guess. Grizzly looked at him. How do you? The letters. James mentioned Billy too, not as often as you, but Henry's voice was careful. He mentioned Billy by name once in one of the last letters. He said Billy had given him a crossword puzzle book to work on during downtime. He said, Henry stopped. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out a folded piece of paper, old soft at the creases, worn from being handled. He unfolded it with the particular care of something irreplaceable. He said, Grandpa, you'd like Billy. He's the kind of person who makes everything seem slightly less impossible. Grizzly stared at the letter. Henry folded it back up, returned it to his pocket. He's still alive, Henry said. Billy, right now tonight he's still alive and you know where he is and you have 24 hours. I can't go back into that. I didn't say anything about going back into anything. Henry's voice was level, precise. I said Billy Orr is alive, the man who held James's hand, the man who called you every week for 2 years to make sure you were still there. He paused. I'm asking you what you're going to do. The room was very quiet again. Viper at his booth was leaning slightly forward without realizing it. Bobby Hatch had completely forgotten that he had a gas station to get back to. Marge was not pretending to do anything. Thomas Cole sat at the counter of the Rusty Spur Diner on the loneliest road in America with his squad leader's dog tags against his chest and his dead best friend's last letter sitting 3 inches away in an old man's breast pocket. And he looked at Henry Pendleton. The job they want me to do, he said, if I do it, even if I do it and get Billy clear, I'm back in. I'm never out. Yes. And if I don't do it, then you need a different way to get Billy out. Henry held his gaze, which may be possible or may not. I don't know. You know that world better than I do. You're not going to tell me what to do, Grizzly said. No. You're just going to sit here. I'm going to finish my coffee, Henry said, and I'm going to be here when you decide. Thomas Cole stood up from the stool. He walked to the window not to look at anything, just to move, to give himself a physical frame around the thinking. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and James Pendleton's dog tags against his chest and 20 years of the wrong kind of survival, pressing up against the possibility, brand new and terrifying, of a different kind. Viper watched him, Marge watched him, Bobby Hatch watched him, and Henry Pendleton looked at his coffee cup and waited. The way a man waits who has all the patience in the world and knows that some things cannot be rushed and some silences are doing more work than any words could. Grizzly turned away from the window. He walked back to the counter. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands on the formica, and he looked at Henry and he said, quietly enough that it was only for the old man, "If I do this the right way, if there is a right way, I'm going to need help." Henry looked up at him. "What kind of help?" Grizzly's jaw tightened. "The kind I haven't asked anyone for in 20 years. The silence held for exactly one beat. Then Henry Pendleton said, "All right, just that. No hesitation, no negotiation, just all right." And something in Thomas Cole's chest, some calcified 20-year-old knot of grief and guilt, and the particular loneliness of men who've seen too much and told no one, shifted a fraction of an inch towards something that was not yet hope, but was at least facing in that direction. All right was two words that cost Henry Pendleton nothing to say and everything to mean, and Thomas Cole understood the difference immediately. He looked at the old man for a long moment. "You don't know what you're agreeing to, yo." "I know exactly what I'm agreeing to, Henry's voice was level. "I'm agreeing to help you think through a problem. I'm not agreeing to anything that gets either of us killed. I'm 82 years old, Thomas. I intend to make 83. Despite everything, Grizzly almost smiled. Fair enough. He sat back down. He leaned his forearms on the counter, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door of the Rusty Spur, the physical architecture of the man changed the held-back, compressed quality that was partly menace and partly something older and sadder than menace, and he became for a moment simply a man with a problem he needed to think through out loud. "Salazar's operation runs out of a property about 60 miles south of here," he said. "Old ranch. Legitimate business, on paper cattle, some agricultural equipment. Off paper, it's a distribution hub. He's been running it that way for 8 years. He paused. "I know the layout. I know the personnel rotation. I know how many people are on site on any given night and where they have positioned themselves. Because you've been there before. Several times." He said it without apology or justification, just fact. "Billy's not on the ranch. Salazar's smarter than that. He uses the ranch for business. For leverage, he uses a separate location. A safe house about 30 miles east of the ranch." He paused. "Reno told me which one." "You trust Reno's information?" "No, but I trust that Salazar wants me to know where Billy is. That's the point. He wants me to know exactly what he's holding and exactly what it costs to get it back." Henry nodded slowly. "He wants you afraid. He wants me compliant. Fear is just the mechanism." "And the job they want you to do," Henry said. "What is it?" Grizzly was quiet for a beat. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "There's a man in Carson City, a state investigator. He's been building a case against Salazar's distribution network for about 14 months. He has a witness, he has documentation, and he's 3 weeks from presenting to a grand jury." He set the cup down. "Salazar wants that stopped." The diner held its breath. "Stopped how?" Henry said, flat and direct. "Stopped in the permanent sense." Grizzly's voice had no inflection on it at all. "That's the job." The weight of it settled over the counter between them. Henry said nothing for a moment. He didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't perform any of the reactions a man might perform who hadn't spent 50 years living with the realities of what human beings were capable of doing to each other. He just sat with it the way you sit with something heavy, and then he said, "That's not something you're going to do." "No," Grizzly said, "it's not." "Then the question is how to get Billy out without doing it. That's the question." He exhaled slowly. "And I've been turning it over for the last 10 minutes, and I keep running into the same wall." "What wall?" "Salazar doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't leave gaps. He's been doing this for 20 years, and he's still standing, which means he's either very lucky or very careful, and I've never known him to be lucky." Grizzly turned to face Henry directly. If I go in without giving him what he wants, I need to come out with Billy, and I need to do it in a way that gives Salazar reason to let it go. Not retaliate, not escalate, just absorb the loss and move on. What would give him reason to do that? Something more valuable than Billy's leverage over me. Grizzly paused. Or something that makes the cost of pursuing it higher than what he'd gain. Henry was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his coffee. He turned the cup once slowly in a circle on the counter. The investigator in Carson City, he said, the one building the case. What about him? Does Salazar know what documentation the investigator has specifically? Grizzly looked at him. He knows enough to know it's a problem, but not the details. Henry's voice had taken on a particular quality, measured, deliberate, the voice of a man who was not speculating, but working towards something specific. What if Salazar found out that the investigator's case was stronger than he thought, not 3 weeks from a grand jury, 3 days? What if he found out that the documentation included direct evidence connecting him personally, not just his network, but him by name with specifics that couldn't be explained away? Grizzly stared at him. That would change his calculus completely. He'd pull all his resources into damage control. He wouldn't have bandwidth to... He stopped. Is any of that true? I have absolutely no idea, Henry said. I'm 82 and I live on the Shoshone Flats, but Salazar doesn't know that. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Viper said from his booth loudly enough that it was clear he'd been listening to every word. Holy language, Marge said automatically from behind the counter. Viper looked at her, looked back at Grizzly. Is he serious? Grizzly was looking at Henry the way you look at something you're recalibrating your entire understanding of. You want to feed him false information, make him think he's already out of time, force him into crisis mode so he's too busy protecting himself to worry about Billy. I want to give him a different problem, Henry said. One that's bigger and more urgent than the one he's currently using to control you. He paused. But for that to work, it needs to come from somewhere he'd believe it. Not from me, not from you. It needs to come from inside, Grizzly said slowly, or close enough to inside that it's credible. Reno, Grizzly said. The name hit the room like a switch being thrown. Bobby Hatch, who had been so still for so long that he'd essentially become part of the counter, suddenly looked up. The man who came in, Henry said, the one you sent outside. He came to me because he's scared, Grizzly said, and as he said it, the shape of something was clearly assembling itself in his mind in real time. Salazar sent him, but Reno has his own reasons for being nervous. He's been in Salazar's operation for 6 years. If the investigator's case is as solid as it sounds, Reno's name is in there too. Does Reno know that? He suspects it. It's why he drove 4 hours to find me instead of making a phone call. He wants a way out. Grizzly's voice had shifted back into something focused and operational, the squad leader's voice, James Pendleton's letters had called it. The voice that made scared people feel like the situation was survivable. If I give him information that suggests the case is further along than Salazar thinks information Reno believes, because I tell him I got it from someone inside the DA's office, would he believe you have that kind of contact? He'd believe I might. Grizzly paused. The question is whether he'd take it to Salazar or sit on it to protect himself. What do you think he'd do? Grizzly thought about it, actually thought, not performing consideration, but engaging with it genuinely. He'd take it to Salazar. Because if it's true and Salazar finds out later that Reno knew and didn't say anything, Reno's situation becomes significantly worse than Billy's. So Reno protects himself by delivering the information. And Salazar goes into crisis mode. And Billy's leverage becomes a problem Salazar doesn't have time for. Grizzly stood up from the stool, not with agitation, with the particular energy of a man who has found a direction and is now oriented toward it. I get to the safe house before Salazar has a chance to think through what he's been told. I get Billy out while Salazar is looking at everything else. That's a narrow window, Henry said. Yes. And if Salazar figures out the information was false before you get Billy clear, then it goes badly. Grizzly said it without decoration. But it goes badly in a way I can navigate, which is better than the only other option. He looked at the old man steadily. Henry looked back at him. You've done this kind of thing before. I've done harder, Grizzly said, with less reason. Something passed between them. Not quite agreement, not quite anything that had a clean name. The acknowledgement of a plan that was imperfect in the way all real plans were imperfect, built from available materials under time pressure, held together with the particular adhesive of having no better choice. "There's one more thing," Henry said. His voice had changed slightly, just slightly, enough that Grizzly caught it and went still. "What?" Henry reached into the inside pocket of his jacket again. Not the breast pocket where James's letter lived, the deeper inside pocket, the one he'd reached into only once this morning to take out the dog tags. He produced a small card paper handwritten. He set it on the counter. Grizzly looked at it. "What is this?" "A phone number." Henry's voice was careful. "I told you I spent 3 years being aware of you. I told you I read everything there was to read." He paused. "I didn't come here today just because of the dog tags." The stillness in the diner took on a different texture. Grizzly looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 3 years of research into Thomas Cole's history puts you in contact eventually with other histories. Other men who came back from Fallujah. Other men who've been watching from a distance, carefully privately, what became of the people they served with." Henry's eyes were very direct. "The number on that card belongs to a man named Gerald Marsh. He goes by Marsh. He was a gunnery sergeant with the 3rd Battalion in 2004. He's been retired for 15 years. He lives in Elko, Nevada. And for the last 4 years, he has been consulting unofficially with the Nevada Department of Criminal Investigation." The silence lasted long enough that the refrigeration unit behind the counter cycled on with a hum that everyone in the room heard clearly. "You're telling me," Grizzly said slowly, "that you have a contact inside the state criminal investigation apparatus." "I'm telling you I have a phone number that was given to me by a man I trust, who told me that if I ever found Thomas Cole, and Thomas Cole ever needed a way to separate himself from the kind of trouble he'd been in, Marsh was a person worth calling." Henry's gaze didn't waver. "I've been carrying that number for 8 months. Grizzly stared at him, and Viper said from the booth, in a voice stripped entirely of his usual performance, just raw and young and genuinely stunned, "He came prepared." "I came hopeful," Henry said without turning around. "There's a difference." Grizzly picked up the card. He looked at it. He set it back down on the counter between them, and he put his finger on it, and he pushed it across to Henry. "I need you to make that call," he said. Henry looked at him. "Why me?" "Because I'm Thomas Cole. I call state investigator, and it's a threat or a setup. You call him?" He stopped. "You're an 82-year-old Korean War veteran whose grandson died in Fallujah. You call him and you tell him there's a former Marine who wants to provide material cooperation with an active investigation in exchange for..." "In exchange for what?" Henry asked. "Protection for you. Protection for Billy." The correction was immediate and absolute. "Billy's clean. He made bad choices under bad circumstances, but his involvement with Salazar was never operational. He was just..." Grizzly's jaw worked. "He was just trying to pay something back that he shouldn't have borrowed. He doesn't deserve to be caught in this." Henry was quiet for a moment. "And you," he said. Grizzly looked at him with an expression that was for the first time something close to unguarded. "I deserve whatever comes." He said it without self-pity, without drama. Just the flat accounting of a man who had kept honest books. "But I'd rather it be the legal kind of whatever comes than the Salazar kind. Those might not be mutually exclusive." "No, they might not." He met Henry's eyes. "I know that. I'm saying it anyway." Henry picked up the card. He looked at it for a moment, turning it in his fingers. From behind the counter, Marge said quietly, not to anyone in particular, not performing anything, just thinking out loud in the way that people do when the situation has grown larger than social convention. "God in heaven, what is happening in my diner today?" Bobby Hatch, who had given up all pretense of having anywhere to be, said, "I have absolutely no idea and I cannot leave." Henry put the card in his jacket pocket. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank the last of it cold now, past motor oil, and into something that had achieved its own geological stratum of bitterness. He set the cup down. "I need to use your telephone, Marge," he said. Marge looked at him. "Mike, you mean I have a landline in the back. It's older than you are." "That'll do fine." He stood up from the stool. The hip made its usual objections, which he acknowledged and overruled. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Grizzly. "Do not," he said, "let that young man back in here while I'm making this call." Grizzly looked at him. "Reno, until we know how this is going to move, I'd prefer he doesn't see you making decisions." Henry's voice was matter of fact. "Keep him outside. Give him coffee if you want to be hospitable. Tell him you're thinking." "I am thinking." "Tell him that then." He walked toward the back of the diner. Marge lifted the pass-through counter for him without being asked. Grizzly watched the old man disappear through the kitchen door. Then he turned to look at Viper. Viper was looking back at him with an expression that Grizzly couldn't fully read, and he could read Viper like a short book had been able to for 9 years. "Say it," Grizzly said. "I'm not saying anything. You're saying something very loudly." Viper looked at the kitchen door, looked back. He sat forward in the booth. "Who is that old man?" he said. "Seriously, who is that? I told you. You told me his grandson died in my unit." Viper's voice was quiet, which was unusual enough to carry its own gravity. "You didn't tell me he was—" He stopped, searched for the word. "Operational." "He's not operational, he's sharp." "Boss," Viper leaned farther forward. "That man walked in here with a plan. He had a contact in his pocket. He had the dog tags, he had the letter, he had the card. He walked in here with—" He stopped again. "He's been working toward this for years." Grizzly was quiet, because Viper was right, and he'd known it from the moment the card appeared. Henry Pendleton had not walked into the Rusty Spur Diner today simply to deliver dog tags and make peace with the past. He had walked in with specific tools for a specific purpose, and the purpose was not just redemption, it was extraction. His grandson's squad leader extracted from the life that was killing him. "He did," Grizzly said. "Does that bother you?" Grizzly thought about it. 20 years of trusting no one. 20 years of being the most dangerous person in any room as a substitute for being the safest. 20 years of building a life out of the wreckage of one morning in Fallujah, and now an 82-year-old man with a bad hip and a cold cup of coffee had just systematically, quietly, and with remarkable patience dismantled the entire architecture. "No," he said. He reached under his shirt. He felt the dog tags against his sternum. "It doesn't bother me at all." 3 of his other men, the ones from the booths who'd been keeping their distance from the conversation, had drifted incrementally closer over the last half hour, the way people drift toward heat. They'd been listening. Not covertly, they weren't performing casualness. They were just there present, waiting for something. The largest of them, a man named Decker, who had ridden with Grizzly for 12 years and said approximately 400 words per year, said Billy Orr. Grizzly looked at him. "I remember Billy," Decker said. "Youngstown, laughed too loud." "You knew him," Grizzly said. "Ran into him maybe 6 years ago. He was doing okay then." Decker's voice was flat and quiet. "He still laughed too loud." The sentence carried everything it needed to in 4 words. "Yeah," Grizzly said. He did. Decker nodded once. Then he said, "Whatever you need. No question, no conditions. Just that." Viper looked at Decker, looked at Grizzly. Something moved through his face, something that might have been the beginning of understanding, something he hadn't understood before about what this life was supposed to mean before it had become what it became. "Whatever you need," Viper said. The kitchen door opened and Henry came back through, moving at his usual deliberate pace, the hip, its usual complicated negotiation. He settled back onto his stool. He folded his hands on the counter. Grizzly watched him. "Well, Howie," Marsh answered on the second ring, Henry said. "He was not entirely surprised to hear from me." "What did he say?" "He said—" Henry paused and something moved through his expression that was too private and too old for the room, and then it passed. He said James Pendleton's grandfather calling about Thomas Cole was a sentence he'd been expecting for 3 years, and he'd started to wonder if he'd have to make the call himself. The words landed on Grizzly like something physical. "He knows who I am," he said. "He knows what you were capable of. He also knows, and I'm telling you his exact words, here he said, 'I know what those boys carried home from that city, and I know that some of them carried it the wrong direction for reasons that had nothing to do with who they were and everything to do with what they were left to manage alone.'" Henry's eyes were steady. He said if Thomas Cole wants a path out of Salazar's orbit, that doesn't end in a federal cell or a ditch somewhere he has 20 minutes to call. He set the card on the counter again. Grizzly looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. In those seconds, every person in the Rusty Spur Diner understood without anyone saying a word that what was happening was not a small thing. Bobby Hatch understood it. Marge understood it. The young couple in the corner booth who had been so frightened an hour ago understood it. Viper understood it, and it was doing something to the corners of his face that he was fighting very hard to control. Decker understood it with the specific comprehension of a man who has seen a fork in a road at the exact moment another man is choosing which direction to walk. Grizzly picked up the card. He took out his phone. He dialed. He stood up from the stool and walked to the far end of the counter, just enough distance for privacy, and when the line picked up, he said quietly enough that the words were his alone. "This is Thomas Cole. I understand you have been expecting this call." Henry looked at his empty coffee cup. Marge materialized with the pot. "Thank you, Marge," he said. "Don't thank me." Her voice was rough in the way voices go rough when they've been doing work they weren't designed for. "Just don't thank me," she poured. At the far end of the counter, Grizzly's voice moved in low, controlled sentences that the distance made inaudible. Henry didn't try to hear them. He wrapped his hands around the fresh cup and he thought about Linda, who had said signs were everywhere if you were paying attention. He thought about James, 22 years old, sending a letter home from a city on fire, writing about the man who made the scared ones feel less scared. He took a sip of coffee. It was still terrible. At the far end of this counter, Grizzly said clearly enough now that Henry caught it. "Billy Orr, yes, that's the priority. Everything else is secondary." A pause, then, "I understand. How long do I have?" Another pause, and then something happened to the set of his shoulders. A fraction of an inch of release, a fraction of an inch of air returning to a room that had been too compressed for too long. 60 miles south, 30 east from there. "Yes, I can have you coordinates in 20 minutes. He lowered the phone. He stood at the end of the counter, not moving for just a moment. Then he walked back. He looked at Henry. "He wants to move tonight," Grizzly said. "He says he can have a team coordinated in 4 hours. He wants me to provide layout of the safe house and personnel information. And he wants Billy out before they move on Salazar's operations, so there's no risk of Billy getting caught up in the sweep." "That's fast," Henry said. "That's how he said it would go if it went." Grizzly paused. "He said there'll be a cooperation arrangement. It won't be simple, and it won't be without consequences. But it'll be legal consequences, the survivable kind. And Reno, the false information. Marsh says don't. He says if I feed Salazar bad intelligence and Salazar goes into crisis mode and starts burning evidence, it could damage the case he's been building." Grizzly sat back down on the stool. He says, "Let him handle the timeline. Let the investigation proceed as it is. Which means Salazar has time to act on Billy. Which means we move faster than Salazar does." He met Henry's eyes. "Which means tonight." Henry looked at him for a moment. "You're going to the safe house," he said. "Not alone, Decker and 2 others, in and out before anyone knows to call Salazar." He paused. "Marsh's people will be positioned." "You trust him. I trust you." The answer was immediate. "And you trust the man who gave you that number." That's 2 layers of trust from an 82-year-old Korean War veteran with James Pendleton's dog tags in his possession. He stopped. "That's more than I've had in 20 years. Henry was quiet for a moment. "I need you to do one thing," Grizzly said. "What's that?" "I need you to go home tonight." His voice was firm, but not cold. "Not because it's dangerous, though it is, but because if something goes sideways, I cannot be thinking about whether you're in the middle of it. I need my head clear." Henry looked at him. "And if it goes right," Grizzly picked up his coffee cup. He finished it cold, bitter motor oil vintage, the same terrible coffee the Rusty Spur had always produced. "If it goes right," he said, "then Tuesday morning I'll be sitting in this diner, your side of the counter." He set the cup down. "And you can tell me what you want to tell me about James. The things that weren't in the letters." Henry held his gaze for a long moment. He nodded once. "Don't be late," he said. "I get here at 9:30 and I don't wait well." And Thomas Cole, Grizzly enforcer, 20 years of survival at the wrong price, said, "Yes, sir." Henry drove home the way he drove everywhere, carefully with both hands on the wheel, and the radio off, which his daughter Carol believed was evidence of his declining faculties, and which was actually evidence that he found silence more useful than most people gave it credit for. The highway unspooled ahead of him in the afternoon heat, and he thought about the morning. He turned it over the way he turned over most things methodically without rushing the uncomfortable parts. He thought about Thomas Cole's face when he'd seen the dog tags. He thought about the particular sound a man's voice makes when it says something true that it has never said out loud before, and how that sound was recognizable across any distance of age or experience, because it was one of the most human sounds there was. He thought about James. He thought, "I hope I did right by you today, son." He turned off the highway onto the gravel road that led to his property, and the Shoshone Flats opened up around him, flat and vast and indifferent, in the way that only desert can be indifferent. Not hostile, just genuinely unconcerned. He had lived here for 31 years. Linda had loved it. She said the desert made her feel like the world was honest. He parked. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a while. Then he picked up the phone and called his daughter, Carol. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, it's Tuesday." "I'm aware it's Tuesday. You only call on Sundays." "I'm aware of that too." He paused. "I just wanted to hear your voice." A silence. Carol had inherited certain qualities from her father, among them the ability to hear what was behind a sentence. "Dad, what happened?" "I had an unusual morning." Define unusual. "I'll tell you about it Sunday," he said. He stopped. He looked at the wall above the kitchen table where Linda's photograph had hung for 31 years, the one from their wedding and the one James had carried in his breast pocket. "I did something today that I should have done years ago, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I think I did right." Carol was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I'm old, and my hip hurts, and I drank 4 cups of Marge's terrible coffee, but I'm fine." "You shouldn't drink 4 cups of anything." "I'm aware." "Dad, I love you, Carol. I'll talk to you Sunday." He hung up. He sat at the table until the light outside changed from afternoon to evening, and then he made himself a sandwich he mostly didn't eat and went to bed at 8 o'clock, which he never did, and lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and waited for sleep, which didn't come for a very long time. 60 miles south and 30 miles east of the Rusty Spur Diner, Thomas Cole sat in a truck on a dirt road and stared at nothing in particular while the desert went dark around him. Decker was in the driver's seat. 2 other men, Reeves and a quiet former Army man named Callum, who'd ridden with them for 3 years and never said more than was necessary, were in the back. Viper was not there because Grizzly had told him specifically and firmly to stay back, and after 10 minutes of argument that Grizzly had let run its course without engaging it, Viper had gone quiet and nodded with the particular expression of a man who disagrees completely and will comply anyway. Reno was also not there. That was the more complicated absence. Grizzly had handled Reno at the diner before leaving, walked him outside, stood with him in the parking lot for 4 minutes while Henry was on the phone with Marsh, and told him 2 things. The first was that the job Salazar wanted done was not going to happen. The second was that whatever happened in the next 24 hours, Reno needed to decide right now which direction he was facing. Reno had gone very pale. "You don't understand what Salazar will—" "I understand exactly what Salazar will do," Grizzly had said. "I've been in his operation for 6 years. I understand it better than you do." He'd paused. "I'm telling you there is a path that isn't Salazar's path. It exists. I'm walking it. The question is whether you're going to walk it with me or spend the next 10 years looking over your shoulder, wondering when it catches up to you." "You're talking about—" Reno had stopped. "You're talking about cooperating. I'm talking about surviving," Grizzly had said. "Which is different." He'd given Reno a number, the number Marsh had told him in the last 30 seconds of their phone call, to give to anyone in Salazar's orbit who wanted a conversation. And then he'd walk back inside, and he hadn't looked back, and he didn't know what Reno had done with it. He still didn't know. That uncertainty sat in the truck with them now like a 5th passenger. "What time did Marsh say?" Decker asked. "His team is positioned by 10. They hold until we're clear with Billy." Grizzly checked his watch. 9:47. "We have 13 minutes. And if Billy's not there—" "He's there." Grizzly's voice was flat. Reno was scared enough to drive 4 hours. He didn't lie about the location. "Unless Reno called Salazar after you let him go. Then the situation changes and we adapt." He paused. "Which is what we do." Decker was quiet for a moment. Then you think this works. I think it's the right thing to do. Grizzly looked out at the darkness. I've stopped requiring it to also be the easy thing. Callum from the back seat said, I never met Billy Orr. No, before your time? What was he like? Grizzly thought about it. He was the kind of man who called someone once a week for 2 years just to make sure they were still standing. He paused. That's not nothing. No, Callum agreed, that's not nothing. They drove. The safe house was a property that looked like every other property in that stretch of Nevada desert. A structure, a truck parked outside, nothing announcing its purpose to anyone passing by. Grizzly had been here twice before years ago, when it had served a different function in Salazar's network. He knew the layout the way he knew most things he needed to know thoroughly and without being proud of it. 2 men outside, one on rotation around the property. He'd been here before. He knew the timing. How do you want to do this? Decker asked. Clean, Grizzly said. No one gets hurt. We're not here to create an incident. We're here to pick up Billy and leave. And if they don't want to let Billy go, then we explain it to them in a way that's persuasive. He checked his watch again. Marsh's people are watching, which means this is documented, which means everyone here tonight is making a decision that will be examined later. He paused. I'm going to tell them that, clearly, at the start. Reeves said quietly, that's either going to work immediately or go completely sideways. Yes, Grizzly agreed. It is. He got out of the truck. What happened next took 11 minutes. Later, Grizzly would not remember it as a sequence of events, so much as a series of decisions, each one clean and specific and made without the hesitation that had characterized so much of his life for the past 20 years. Not recklessness, precision. The difference between a man acting out of desperation and a man acting out of clarity. He walked up to the 2 men outside. He told them his name, which they already knew. He told them why he was there, which they didn't expect. He told them that the Nevada Department of Criminal Investigation had personnel within a half-mile of this location who were currently observing everything that happened, and that everyone present tonight was going to be interviewed about their role in what occurred, and that the men who facilitated the safe release of Billy Orr were going to be looked at very differently than the men who didn't. One of them reached for his phone. That's fine, Grizzly said. Call whoever you need to call, but consider that it's 10 o'clock at night and your employer has other concerns right now, and by the time you get an answer from him, this is either already resolved or it's considerably worse. The 2 men looked at each other. The one who'd reached for his phone put it away. 6 minutes later, Billy Orr came through the door. He was 44 years old. He'd been a big man, once the build of someone who'd spent years doing physical work, who'd carried gear through streets and across rooftops. What came through that door was thinner, slower, carrying the specific posture of a man who had been in a bad situation for long enough that his body had started to believe it was permanent. He blinked in the darkness. He looked at Thomas Cole. He didn't say anything for a moment. Thomas Cole didn't say anything either. Then Billy Orr said in a voice that cracked in the middle, "You're late. I've been waiting on you for 20 years. And Grizzly crossed the distance between them, and the 2 men held each other up for a moment, the way men do who have been through something that words weren't designed to carry, and didn't say anything else for a while. Decker watched this from 6 feet away with his arms crossed and his face arranged in its usual configuration of saying nothing, and nobody who knew Decker would have noticed anything particular happening in the area of his eyes. Callum looked at the desert sky. Reeves took a step back and checked his watch and said nothing. Let's go, Grizzly said finally. They went. Marsh's team moved on Salazar's ranch at 2 in the morning. Grizzly was not there for it. He was in a hospital 40 miles away, waiting while a doctor examined Billy and told him that his patient was dehydrated, had 2 cracked ribs, and had gone about a week and a half without what the doctor diplomatically called adequate care, but was going to be fine. Going to be fine being defined as not permanently damaged, capable of recovery, in possession of all the things that mattered. Grizzly sat in a waiting room chair and stared at the floor tiles and thought about James Pendleton. He thought about the last 14 months. The letters James had been writing home to his grandfather while Grizzly hadn't known about them. Hadn't known that the young corporal with the crossword puzzles and the too loud laugh were cataloging the soul of their squad leader in sentences that would survive him by 20 years and end up in an old man's breast pocket on a Tuesday morning in a Nevada diner. He thought James knew me better than I knew myself. He thought I owe that boy everything and there's only one way to pay it. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize, Nevada area code, nothing more. He answered. Cole. Mr. Cole. A voice he didn't know. Professional measured. My name is Agent Deloria. I work with Gerald Marsh. I wanted to inform you that we have secured the ranch property and have taken Salazar and 11 members of his organization into custody. There were no casualties. A pause. Mr. Marsh asked me to tell you that the operation went cleanly and that he'd like to meet with you in the morning to begin the formal cooperation process. Grizzly was quiet for a moment. No casualties, he repeated. None. He thought about what that meant. He thought about what it cost and what it changed and what it started. Tell Marsh I'll be there, he said. He hung up. He sat in the waiting room and looked at his hands, the same hands he'd been looking at for 20 years, and seeing things in that he hadn't wanted to see. He turned them over. He looked at them for a long time. Then the doctor came back out and said Billy was asking for him, and he stood up and went in. Billy Orr was sitting up in a hospital bed looking like something assembled from leftover parts with 2 days of beard and eyes that were trying to be brighter than the rest of him could currently manage. He looked at Grizzly and made a face that wasn't quite a smile but was aimed in that direction. You look terrible, Billy said. You look worse. I've had a rough week and a half. I noticed. Grizzly pulled the chair next to the bed. He sat. He leaned his forearms on his knees. How are you? My ribs hurt. I know. The doctor told me I was dehydrated. I know that too. He used the phrase adequate care in a way that suggested Billy. Yeah. How are you? Billy stopped. He looked at his hands in his lap. His jaw worked for a moment. I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought this time might actually be it. Salazar's people, they're not, he exhaled, they're not patient people. No. I kept thinking if someone knew where... He stopped again. I thought about calling you 100 times. I didn't because I thought I'd put you in a worse position. You should have called. I know that now. You should have called 6 years ago, Billy, when you first got into the debt situation. I know that too. Billy looked up. I'm sorry I didn't. Grizzly looked at him for a moment. I'm sorry I didn't pick up the phone 3 months into your calls, 7 years ago, when you were still calling every week. He paused. I should have picked up. Billy was quiet. Grizzly stopped. This was the part that didn't have clean language. I got lost for a while after Fallujah. I went in the wrong direction, and I went a long way in it before I could find the exit. I know, Billy said. I watched it happen. I just couldn't. He shook his head. I didn't know how to pull you back from that distance. You called every week for 2 years. And then I stopped. You stopped because I stopped answering. That's on me, not you. They sat with that for a moment. Then Billy said, James's grandfather found you. Grizzly looked at him sharply. How did you know about that? Because it's the only thing that would have made this happen tonight. Billy's voice was simple, certain. I knew him. Henry Pendleton. James used to talk about him all the time. He was Thomas. That man was James's whole world outside the core. He paused. James said someday he wanted to introduce us. He wanted his grandfather to meet his squad. Billy's voice roughened. He kept saying Grandpa would love you guys. Grizzly looked at the door, at the wall, at his hands. He would have, he said finally. What's he like? Grizzly thought about how to answer though. He thought about Henry Pendleton walking the length of the Rusty Spur Diner with a bad hip and a soldier's spine, and nobody in the room breathing while he did it. He thought about the card in the jacket pocket, the number carried for 8 months on the off chance that Thomas Cole would need it. He thought about 2 words all right spoken without hesitation or condition. He's exactly like James said, Grizzly told him. Everything you'd expect and nothing you'd be ready for. Billy absorbed this. Is he okay? He went home this afternoon. He made me promise to be at the diner next Tuesday morning. Are you going? Grizzly touched the dog tags through his shirt. Yes. Billy looked at him, really looked the way men look at each other when they've been through the kind of things that strip the social performance away and leave the actual person visible. You're different, Billy said. Just since tonight, you're something changed. This morning, Grizzly said. It changed this morning. What did he say to you? Grizzly was quiet for a moment. He said James knew I was worth saving. He paused, and that James was accurate. Billy looked at him for a long beat. Then he looked at the ceiling and made a sound that was 3 parts exhaustion and 1 part something else, relief maybe, or the particular emotional compound that assembles itself when you have been afraid for long enough that the absence of fear feels like its own sensation. That sounds like James, he said. Yeah, Grizzly agreed. It does. Billy closed his eyes. He was quiet for a moment. Then without opening them, Tom, yeah. I'm glad you came. I know. I didn't say it right. He stopped. I'm really glad you came. I thought about calling. I thought Tom's too deep in it. Tom can't pull me out without pulling himself under. I thought, Billy? Yeah. I know. Grizzly sat back in the chair. Get some sleep. A silence, then muffled by exhaustion and the beginning of real sleep for the first time in a week and a half. Are you going to be here when I wake up? Grizzly looked at the man in the bed, at the cracked ribs and the dehydration and the too thin face that had once belonged to someone who laughed too loud and sent crossword puzzle books to scared young soldiers and called a broken man every week just to check. Yes, he said, I'm going to be here. Billy slept. Grizzly sat in the chair and watched the monitor that tracked his friend's heartbeat, steady, persistent, alive, and somewhere in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, in the particular quiet of a hospital at that hour, he did something he hadn't done since he was 7 years old. He put his face in his hands, and he let it out. Not performance, not the managed, controlled cracking that had happened at the diner counter with Henry watching. This was the full weight, 20 years of it, finally finding a place to land. The grief of James Pendleton and the guilt of living and the wrong roads and the right road started too late, and Billy's cracked ribs and Henry's cold coffee and Linda tapping her husband's knuckles and the jukebox playing Merle Haggard and the dog tags against his chest, warm, always warm, the temperature of something alive. He sat with it until it was done. Then he straightened up. He reached under his shirt and held the dog tags in his closed fist and said without sound something private that belonged only to him and James in the specific silence of a hospital room at 3 in the morning. Then he let them go. He leaned back in the chair. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 20 years, when he slept, the dream did not come. Henry Pendleton's phone rang at 5:47 in the morning. He was already awake, had been since 4, which was normal for a man of his age in the current condition of his mind. He was at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, which was considerably better than Marge's, and James's letters in a stack in front of him that he'd been reading and rereading for the past hour. He picked up the phone, unknown number. Pendleton, he said. A pause, then he's out. Thomas Cole's voice, rougher than it had been in the diner, carrying the texture of a night that had done a great deal of work. Billy, he's in a hospital. He's going to be fine. Henry put his hand flat on the table. He said, good. Salazar's in custody. Marsh's team moved at 2. Good, Henry said again. Another pause. Sir? Grizzly's voice shifted slightly, something younger in it or something older, depending on how you measured those things. I don't know how to. I'm not. Then don't, Henry said simply. The silence held. Tuesday, Henry said. 9:30. Don't be late. He heard something on the other end that might have been a breath or might have been a word that didn't quite make it out. Yes, sir, Thomas Cole said. Henry set the phone down. He looked at James's letters on the table, 14 of them, 1 for each month, neat and worn, and full of a young man who had believed without reservation in the people around him. Henry sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and he looked out the window at the Shoshone Flats going gold in the early light, and he said to the empty kitchen, to Linda's photograph on the wall, to no one and to everyone who mattered. We did right by him. The meeting with Marsh lasted 3 hours. It took place in a conference room in a federal building in Carson City, with 2 other agents present and a lawyer the state had provided. And it was the longest sustained act of honesty Thomas Cole had performed in 20 years. He said things in that room that he had never said out loud in any context. He gave names, dates, locations, operational details, the architecture of 6 years inside Salazar's network laid out in plain language, without flinching and without asking for anything in return, until everything that needed to be said had been said. Then at the end of the third hour, Marsh leaned back in his chair and looked at him across the table with the eyes of a man who had heard a great deal of testimony in his career and had developed the ability to distinguish the kind that cost something from the kind that didn't. That's comprehensive, Marsh said. That's everything, Grizzly said. There are going to be consequences. I want you to understand that clearly before we discuss the arrangement. Cooperation doesn't mean immunity. It means the difference between a path forward and no path at all. I understand. There will be charges, reduced given what you've provided today, substantially reduced given that your cooperation enabled us to take Salazar off the board before that investigator in Carson City had to be put at any further risk. But there will be a record. There will be conditions. What kind of conditions? Marsh looked at him steadily. The kind you can live with if you actually intend to live differently. He paused. Do you? Grizzly held his gaze. That's the only reason I'm in this room. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and uncapped it. Then let's talk about the arrangement. What happened in the next hour was legal and procedural and involved language that Grizzly parsed carefully the way he'd once parsed intelligence reports in a city on fire, looking for the gaps, the assumptions, the places where a word's meaning could shift, depending on the pressure applied to it. He asked questions. The lawyer answered some of them. Marsh answered the rest. When it was done, Grizzly signed his name to a document with a steadier hand than he would have predicted. He walked out of the building into Nevada morning sunlight, and he stood on the sidewalk and breathed for a moment. His phone buzzed. Viper. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. Where are you? Viper said immediately. Carson City. A beat. You okay? Yes. How'd it go? It went the way it needed to go. He paused. How are things there? Complicated. Viper's voice had a texture to it that Grizzly hadn't heard before. Not the performed edge of a man working to seem dangerous, but the genuine complicated texture of someone trying to navigate something real. 3 of the guys left last night, packed up, headed north. They said, he stopped. They said they didn't sign up for whatever this is. I know. Decker stayed, Callum stayed, Reeves stayed. Another pause. I stayed. I know that too. Boss? Viper's voice dropped. What happens now to the club? To what are we? I don't know yet, Grizzly said honestly. But I know what we're not anymore. And I know what I'm trying to be. And I know that the men who stayed this morning are the men worth figuring the rest of it out with. Silence on the line. Then Viper said in a voice that had dropped all its armor, he really was your squad leader's grandfather. That old man. Yes. And he came in with the dog tags and the phone number and the whole yes. Thomas. It was the first time the Viper had called him that. Not boss, not Grizzly. Thomas. That old man could have hated you. He had every reason. He probably did for a while, Grizzly said. He told me so. But he didn't come to the diner with hate. No, he didn't. Viper was quiet for a long moment. I want to meet him someday. I want to meet him. Tuesday, Grizzly said, 9:30. Rusty Spur Diner on Highway 50. He's going to be there. Every Tuesday for 11 years. I don't think this one's going to be different. He heard Viper exhale something releasing in it, the way air releases from something that's been compressed. I'll be there, Viper said. Grizzly almost said something about that, almost managed it. Instead, he said, drive careful, and hung up and stood on the sidewalk in Carson City a moment longer before walking to his truck. Spam. Billy was discharged from the hospital Wednesday afternoon. His sister drove up from Las Vegas to get him a woman named Diane who had the same Youngstown directness as her brother and the additional feature of being completely unintimidated by anything on 2 wheels. She walked into the hospital room, took one look at Thomas Cole sitting in the chair by the bed and said, "You're the squad leader." "Yes, ma'am." "He talked about you for 20 years. She set Billy's bag on the chair by the door and looked at Grizzly with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. "I thought about what I was going to say to you if I ever met you. I had a whole speech ready." Grizzly looked at her steadily. "I'll hear it if you want to give it." She studied him for a moment. "Then I don't think I need to anymore." She turned to her brother. "You look terrible." "Tom said the same thing," Billy said. "Tom's right." She started gathering his things with the efficient movements of someone who had been holding a family together by herself for a very long time. Cracked ribs and dehydration. You have a doctor in Las Vegas. I made you an appointment for Friday. Diane. Friday, Billy. Billy looked at Grizzly with the expression of a man seeking solidarity. Grizzly offered none. Friday sounds right, he said. Billy made a face. Traitor. Also, Diane said, not pausing in her organizing, I spoke to someone named Marsh yesterday. He explained the situation. He explained your situation. She looked at Grizzly. And yours. Diane, Billy said carefully. I'm not angry, she said. And she said it to Grizzly directly, and the directness of it was the most honest thing in the room. I was angry. For 2 days I was so angry I couldn't see straight. Not just at, she stopped, composed herself with visible effort. Billy made his own choices, I know that, but you, she paused. You were supposed to lead them. That's what Billy always said. The squad leader leads. The words landed where they were aimed. Grizzly didn't look away. Yes, he said. He was right. And you led in the wrong direction for a long time. Yes. And now, he reached under his shirt. He held the dog tags through the fabric the way Henry had held them before he'd taken them out in the diner. Now I'm trying to figure out what leading in the right direction looks like for a man who's starting late. Diane looked at him for a very long moment. Then she said in a voice that had softened by about 10 degrees from where it had started, Billy says there's an old man, the grandfather. Henry Pendleton. He says that man walked into a diner full of... She glanced at Billy. He says that man walked in and changed everything in one morning. He did. I'd like to meet him someday. Tuesday, Grizzly said, 9:30, if you're still in Nevada. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Calculation, decision. The particular choice that people make when they decide to extend something they are not obligated to extend. We might be, she said. Billy from the bed. Are we? Diane picked up his bag. Get your shoes on, Billy. Jutin. The days between Wednesday and Tuesday were the strangest days Thomas Cole had spent in 20 years. Not because of the legal process, the meetings, the paperwork, the conditions, the attorney who was sharp and unsentimental, and who told him flat out that he was going to face a period of significant inconvenience, but that she'd seen people come out of worse arrangements in better shape than they'd entered them, which was the most she could honestly offer. That part had a shape to it, a structure. He understood structure. What was strange was the quiet. He was staying at a motel in Ely, nothing remarkable about it. 4 walls and a bed and a coffee maker that worked if you held the button down for 3 seconds. And in the evenings after the meetings and the calls and the procedural machinery of consequence, there was nothing. Just the quiet, just him and the dog tags and the particular experience of a man who has stopped running long enough to hear what his own mind sounds like when it isn't in motion. He called Henry twice, not because he needed anything specific, not because there were problems to solve or decisions to make, but because the old man's voice had a quality to it that he couldn't name precisely except to say that it made the quiet feel less like a void and more like a space in which something could grow. Henry picked up both times on the second ring. The first time they talked for 40 minutes about James, the things that weren't in the letters, the stories that only a grandfather carried James at 7 years old and James at 17, and James the morning before he left for boot camp, who had hugged Henry in a way that neither of them had known was a kind of goodbye. The second time they talked for 20 minutes about Linda Henry, telling stories about her without prompting, as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask and as if the accumulated material of 52 years of marriage had been under pressure and needed somewhere to go. Grizzly mostly listened. He was good at listening. He'd forgotten that about himself. On Saturday, Viper called to say that Decker had asked about the arrangement not with hostility, just wanting to understand what came next and what shape their lives were supposed to take. Grizzly told him what he could. Some of it was still being determined. Some of it he didn't know yet. But you're going forward, Viper said, with the cooperation, with all of it. Yes. No going back. No going back. A long pause. I think Viper started again. I think maybe some of us went in the wrong direction too. Not the same way, but he stopped. I think some of us have been waiting for someone to give us a reason to stop. You don't need a reason, Grizzly said. You need a decision. Isn't that the same thing? No, Grizzly said. A reason is something you find. A decision is something you make. One of them waits for permission. The other one doesn't. The silence on the line had a particular quality to it. Then Viper said, Tuesday, 9:30. Drive careful, Grizzly said. Enfin. Monday night, he took the Hells Angels vest out of his bag. He'd been carrying it without thinking about it, the way you carry things that have been part of your body for so long, you stop registering them as separate objects. He held it in his hands for a long time. He looked at the patch. He thought about the 17 years it represented and the man who'd worn it and the choices that had accumulated into a life that he was now at 45 years old in the process of dismantling and rebuilding from the foundation. He thought about what Henry had said. Not the things about redemption, though those had weight. The specific sentence, you start building it around what you do after. After. He folded the vest carefully. He put it in the bottom of the bag. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it. That was a decision for a different day, a day when the shape of what he was building was clearer. But he knew he wasn't going to wear it into the Rusty Spur Diner tomorrow morning. He wasn't that man anymore. He didn't know yet with precision what man he was. But he knew what one he wasn't. That was somewhere to start. Henry Pendleton arrived at the Rusty Spur Diner at 9:15 Tuesday morning. 15 minutes early. He told himself this was because he had woken up early and there was no reason to sit at home. He did not tell himself that he'd been awake since 4:45 and had checked the clock 17 times between 5 and 8. Marge was already there. She took one look at him, his good jacket, the careful way he'd combed his hair, the particular quality of his posture that said this was not an ordinary Tuesday, and she said nothing. She poured his coffee. She put a slice of cherry pie on the counter beside him without being asked. You baked yesterday, Henry said. Monday's when I bake. I know. He looked at the pie. You made extra. She turned back to the coffee maker without answering. But he could see the line of her shoulders, and he knew Marge well enough to know what it meant when they carried themselves like that, like a woman who has decided without making a production of it, that this particular Tuesday was going to be taken seriously. Bobby Hatch came in at 9:20. He sat at the counter 3 stools down, ordered his coffee, and looked at the door with the manufactured casualness of a man who absolutely did not have a reason to be here early. Bobby, Henry said. Henry, you have a gas station to open. I opened it at 7. Patty's watching it. A pause. She knows how to work the register. Henry said nothing. I just thought Bobby stopped. I had coffee over here most mornings before you got here for 11 years, Henry. You never knew because you always arrive after the rush. So this isn't unusual for me. Today is unusual for everyone, Henry said simply. Bobby opened his mouth, closed it, drank his coffee. At 9:28, 2 things happened simultaneously. The door opened and a woman walked in that Henry had not expected, had not called, had not prepared for in any way. She was 58 years old with her father's eyes and her mother's way of moving through a room and a look on her face that said she had driven from Reno this morning specifically, and she was both furious and completely unable to be anywhere else. Henry looked at his daughter, Carol. Carol looked at her father. You told me Sunday, she said, and her voice was controlled in the way voices are when they've been rehearsing themselves in the car for 3.5 hours. You said you'd tell me about your unusual morning. You told me you'd done something you should have done years ago. I did say that. You didn't say it involved Hells Angels and federal investigations, and she stopped. She sat down on the stool next to him. Linda's stool with the decisive movement of a woman who has driven 3.5 hours on a Tuesday and earned the right to sit wherever she wants. I called Marcia's office this morning. Henry looked at her. Why? Because I'm your daughter, and you gave me the number 8 months ago and told me if something happened to you, I should call it. Her voice broke slightly on the last word and then solidified again immediately. I didn't know what to expect. He told me everything went fine. He told me, she stopped. He told me you'd been carrying Gerald Marsh's number for 8 months and that you'd used it in service of James's squad leader. Yes. Thomas Cole. Yes. The man Marsh's office has a file on, that is, she stopped again. Dad. Carol. You walked into a diner full of, I did. With the dog tags. Yes. Lone. Marge was there. Bobby was there. Bobby raised his hand slightly and then lowered it. Carol looked at her father for a long, complicated moment. There was anger in it and fear that was already converting itself into something else because the danger was past, and fear without immediate cause transforms quickly in the presence of someone you love. There was something else too, something private and specific to the woman who had been James' aunt, who had cried properly at least once a day for 2 years, who had never entirely stopped finding things. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Henry was quiet for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure it was going to work," he said honestly, "and I didn't want you to carry it if it didn't. I'm your daughter, Desad. I carry everything anyway." "I know." He put his hand over hers on the counter. "I know that, Carol." The door opened. Thomas Cole came in. He was wearing a plain flannel shirt and dark jeans and boots that had seen significant mileage. And without the vest, he looked different, not smaller exactly, but differently proportioned, as if the absence of the thing revealed more of the actual man than its presence had ever allowed. He stood in the doorway for one beat, reading the room the way he always read rooms, and his eyes found Henry at the counter, and he moved toward him. He was not alone. Billy Orr came in behind him, slower, one hand moving almost to his ribs before he caught himself. He had color back in his face. He was not yet the man from before that would take months, maybe longer, but he was present in a way that the man Grizzly had walked out of that safe house with had not been entirely present. Behind Billy came Diane, who had apparently decided that staying in Nevada was in fact what they were doing. Behind Diane came Viper, 29 years old, scraped clean of performance, looking around the Rusty Spur Diner with the eyes of someone entering a place that has been described to them and finding it both exactly what they expected and nothing like they imagined. Behind Viper came Decker, who took in the diner with one sweep and selected a stool at the far end of the counter and sat down and nodded at Marge, who nodded back. The Rusty Spur Diner had not had this many people in it on a Tuesday morning since a road closure in 2019 had redirected traffic and Marge had run out of pie by 10:30 and had talked about it for 3 months. Grizzly reached the counter. He looked at Henry. Henry looked at him. "9:30, Henry said. "You're a minute early." "I didn't want to be late." He looked at Carol, registering her presence, the resemblance to James that lived in her eyes. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," Carol, Henry said. "This is Thomas Cole." Carol looked at the man who had been in Fallujah with her nephew, who had been in the wrong building when the wrong thing happened, who had carried it for 20 years in the worst possible way, and was standing in a Nevada diner on a Tuesday morning, trying with evident difficulty to figure out what the right thing to say to a woman who had cried every day for 2 years was. He started, "Mrs. Don't," she said. He stopped. She stood up from the stool. And then Carol Pendleton, 58 years old, Reno, Nevada James's aunt, Henry's daughter, Linda's girl, put her arms around Thomas Cole and held on, and the sheer unexpectedness of it, the absolute undefended grace of it hit him somewhere so far below any of his defenses that he couldn't move for a full 3 seconds. Then his arms came up, and he held on too. Viper, 3 feet away, turned to look at the wall with great focus. Marge poured coffee for 6 people without being asked. Bobby Hatch looked at the ceiling and cleared his throat. Billy Orr sat down heavily on the nearest stool and looked at his hands and said nothing and didn't need to. Carol stepped back. She had composed herself, the Pendleton composure, efficient and total, deployed with the speed of long practice. She sat back down. She picked up her coffee. "He talked about you," she said to Grizzly. "In his letters, he called you Tom." "I know." His voice was rough at the edges. "Your father told me. He said you made the scared ones feel less scared." She paused. "He wasn't easily impressed. He got that from his grandfather." She glanced at Henry and his grandmother. Henry said nothing, but his eyes moved to Linda's photograph, the one that lived in his jacket pocket, now that had lived against James's chest for 14 months, and something in his face was very quiet and very full at the same time. Grizzly sat down on the stool beside Henry. Henry pushed the cherry pie toward him without a word. Grizzly looked at it. "Is this good?" "No," Henry said. "It's terrible. Eat it anyway." He ate it. Billy settled onto the stool on the other side, and Marge put pie in front of him too, and he ate it without comment, which said everything about the quality of the week and a half he'd had. Viper ended up next to Billy. He looked at the pie. He looked at Marge. He said, "Do you have anything that isn't pie?" "I have eggs," Marge said. "I'll have eggs." I'll have eggs too, Diane said from the stool next to Viper. Toast, Marge said. Please, Diane said. The diner filled with the particular sound of ordinary morning coffee cups and cutlery, and the refrigeration unit cycling, and the jukebox in the corner doing nothing because nobody had kicked it yet. Just the sounds of people in a room eating and existing and managing in the way that people manage the distance between what was and what is and what might yet be. Henry ate his pie. He drank his coffee. He listened to Billy tell Viper something about Youngstown that had Viper making a face of disbelief. He listened to Diane tell Carol something about the drive from Las Vegas, and Carol telling her something back about the drive from Reno. He listened to Decker order his coffee from Marge with 3 words, and Marge respond with 2. He listened to the room the way Linda had always said he should listen to things, not for the information, but for the fact of it. The fact of this specific collection of people in this specific place on this specific Tuesday morning, assembled by a chain of events that had started with a young man in Fallujah who believed in the people around him. Tom, Henry said. Grizzly looked at him. I want to tell you something that wasn't in the letters. The room didn't exactly go quiet, it adjusted. The way rooms adjust when the person who holds the gravity of a moment speaks. James called me, Henry said, 3 weeks before the end. He called from somewhere, I don't know where, there was a lot of noise in the background. He called and I couldn't hear much of what he was saying, and then the connection cleared for about 40 seconds. Henry set down his fork. He said, Grandpa, I found the kind of leader you always told me to look for, the kind who makes you feel like the job is possible even when it isn't. And then the connection broke again. He paused. That was the last time I heard his voice. The table, the counter, the stools, the Tuesday morning diner held that for a moment. He was talking about you, Carol said softly, not to Grizzly specifically, to the air, to James, to the way things are confirmed after the fact when it's too late to tell the person who needed to hear it, but not too late for everyone else. Grizzly's hand was flat on the counter. He was 22 years old, he said. His voice was careful. He had no business being that. He stopped. He was better than where he was. He was better than all of it. He deserved to come home, Henry said simply. Yes, he did, and he didn't. And that is the worst true thing in my life, and I have made my peace with it, not because it stopped being terrible, but because James would be furious to see me waste whatever time I have left being destroyed by it. He looked at Grizzly steadily. The same applies to you. Grizzly looked at him. You were his squad leader, Henry said. You still are. You lead from where you are with what you have in the direction of who you're trying to be. He paused. That's what he believed you capable of. That's what I believe you capable of. The question is whether you believe it yourself. The Tuesday morning diner hummed and breathed around them. Viper had stopped talking to Billy. Decker's coffee cup was still. Diane and Carol had stopped their conversation. Bobby Hatch had long since abandoned any pretense of having somewhere else to be. Marge stood behind the counter with her hands folded and her face composed in the particular expression of a woman who has run a diner on the loneliest road in America for 31 years and understands without requiring anyone to explain it when something of significance is occurring on her premises. Thomas Cole reached under his shirt. He unclasped the chain. He held the dog tags in his hand, warm, always warm, and he looked at them for a moment. Then he set them on the counter in front of Henry. Henry looked down at them. Those are yours, Grizzly said. I needed them last week. I don't need them anymore. He paused. I have what they represented. I don't need to wear the reminder. Henry looked at the dog tags for a long moment. Then he picked them up and he held them in his closed hand, and he reached out and placed his closed fist gently over Grizzly's hand on the counter. He held it there for one moment. He let go. Tuesday, Henry said. Same time. Same time, Grizzly said. Not a question, not a plan. A fact the kind that gets made by deciding it is one and held together by the same decision made again the following week and the week after, and all the weeks that followed for as long as weeks were available, which for Thomas Cole was the rest of his life, however long, in whatever shape it took, built now on something other than survival. Built on the specific and demanding and daily work of becoming finally the man that a 22-year-old corporal had described in a letter home from a burning city, the kind of leader who makes you feel like the job is possible even when it isn't. He could do that. He was going to do that. Henry Pendleton finished his coffee, set the cup down in its saucer with the particular finality of a man who has completed the thing he came to do, and looked out the window at Highway 50, cutting through the Nevada desert, the loneliest road in America, which on this Tuesday morning, in this diner, with this unlikely collection of people, and their accumulated weight of grief and guilt, and the hard, slow, irreversible work of choosing to live forward, felt for the first time in a very long time like anything but. Some roads look loneliest right before they lead you home. And Henry Pendleton, 82 years old Korean War veteran, keeper of letters and dog tags, and the particular stubborn hope of a man who had decided that 20 years was long enough for anyone to carry the wrong thing. Henry Pendleton knew, with the certainty of a man who has stopped requiring proof before he acts on what he believes, that his grandson had not been wrong about a single person he had ever trusted. Not one.